Okay, Chapter 19, Reflections, Success and Failure in History. We must be very careful in applying ideas of success and failure to historical complexities. A lot depends on the criteria we apply, and we need to consider the issue of success for whom. Historical actors are never completely free in making decisions, and they lack the benefit of hindsight that we get to use when we go back and study these. And so, should historians evaluate events as successful or a failure? Historians don't just recount history, they evaluate history. So is it appropriate for historians to call something as a success, or is it appropriate to call it a failure? And what would be the criteria for this judgment? And who did the event in question benefit? Who lost out? Those are all major factors when evaluating in history. And how would a historian figure out if a decision was a wise choice? So it's also about assessing the wisdom in history. Some things to think about. Okay, let's look at these visual sources. Okay, the black ships. Love this. The Japanese artists loved to portray the American warships here belching out their black smoke and carrying large crews and their mounted cannons, and they became known in Japan as black ships. And here is one of the best known depictions of the American black ships. So what's the general impression of the American intrusion did this artist seek to convey? Well, the American intrusion was forced on the Japanese and was an undertaken using technologically advanced ships. And the image also has a fanciful side that suggests physical ugliness and demonic or supernatural powers associated with those that are aboard the ship. And the specific features of the image, how does that help the artist make his case? Well, there's the prominence of the mounted cannons, the steam technology, and the anthropomorphic features of the ship, which give it a ominous personality. And so why do you think the artist might have chosen to depict the gunfire coming from the American ship as streams of light? I think that's interesting. The streams of light suggest fire, maybe, and therefore destruction. But the depiction makes the cannon appear more powerful than traditional cannons that where you would just see the smoke. Okay, here we have the women in Westernization. Japan, in the late 1800s, was in the midst of an amazing transformation. And part of that was from Perry's forced opening of the Japanese. And, by then Japan had a new government, and the government was really committed to modernizing and getting influence from the West to do this. So what elements of Western culture can you identify in this visual source? Well, first we have the piano, the hats and the dress, right? Very European. Even their hairstyles. Military uniform on the boy. See the architecture of the buildings. And possibly the chair here in the central foreground. That looks very European. So what ways does this print reflect the continuing appeal of Japanese culture? And really pay attention to the scenery here, like the tree and the flowers. So the background is a garden of Japanese inspiration. The pond, the cherry trees, and a small circular shelter toward the right of the background of the scene. And the layered dress of the women in the middle of the scene reflect Japanese influence. Right? The vase holding the flowers to the right, possibly Chinese in origin. So why were so many Japanese so enamored of Western culture during this time? Right? And, big part of that was the Japanese government so actively encouraging this interest. Well, the Japanese were committed to creating a new culture based on those Western models, and they really wanted to revive Japan to stave off the West as opposed to succumbing to the West and their influence like the Ottomans and especially the Chinese had. Well, many Japanese students during this time period traveled or lived in the West and studied. The Japanese court embraced Western fashion. Right, and the government sought to catch up with the economic and military might of the Western powers, and they believed that copying some of those aspects of Western culture would facilitate that. Okay, Kobayashi Kiyoshika's critique of wholesale Westernization. This is a great image. We see specific aspects of Japan's efforts at Westernization, but the artist is mocking that, right? The slavish copying of Western dress, ridiculing the belief that copying Western fashions and clothing would help Japan catch up with Western economic and military power. So why might the artist have used a Western scientific theory like Darwinism evolution to criticize excessive Westernization in Japan? Right? Can you see it? Well, perhaps the artist wished to associate what he believed was a ridiculous Western theory to the equally ridiculous copying of Western fashion. Alternatively, he may have wanted to highlight the difference between embracing useful Western scientific knowledge and the copying of Western fashion, which did not in itself strengthen Japan. So why do you think a reaction set in against the cultural imitation of Europe? Well, a reason for the reaction may have been cultural pride and nationalism. Many may have feared losing a distinct Japanese identity, and there was a likely growing disillusionment with Western culture and what it had to offer because it was already so different. Right? All the monkeys dressed in European style and in every aspect trying to ape foreigners. Right? Social Darwinism. Okay, and the last image, Japan, China, and Europe, a reversal of roles. I think this picture is phenomenal. Behind Japan's modernization and Westernization was the recognition that Western imperialism was really surging in Asia, and specifically that of China, being that prime example of what happened to countries who were unable to defend themselves. And achieving political and military equality with the great powers of Europe and the United States became a central goal of Japan's modernization program. So what overall message did the artist seek to convey in this print? Well, probably that Japan was the dominant power in East Asia. Japan had outmaneuvered the other major powers in East Asia. Japanese Navy was critical to Japanese power, right? Dressed in their Navy uniforms, controlling the others. What is the significance of the Chinese figure with the chicken in their hand, lying as bait at the bottom of the image? Well, the figure represents probably the weakness of China, already, down, its failure to react to international threats, and its current victimization by other foreign powers. And the lethargic nature of this Japanese character may be the result of the opium pipe in his hand, right, which represents the opium epidemic in Chinese society. And how is this Russian character portrayed? He's portrayed as a bear, supposed to be a bear, diving right into China, and he lacks cunning. He's fallen right into the Japanese trap. And what changed in Japanese thinking about China and Europe during the 19th century? Well, China's cultural influence on Japan declined, significantly. And Japan saw itself as a competitor with European powers, capable of establishing its own empire and facing off against those European powers, which is significant for the Japanese industrialization and modernization process. And historically, the Japanese have borrowed a great deal from China: Buddhism, Confucianism, court rituals, even infrastructure ideas and planning, administrative traditions, following that of Confucianism, even their writing in the Chinese script. But the Japanese victory against China in the Sino-Japanese War in 1894 and 1895 really showed clearly that it had thrown off the Japanese, thrown off that cultural shadow that they'd lived in for centuries, and really was becoming its own East Asian empire. And that's the end of chapter 19.